For today's discussion, we're focusing on ONDC, or the Open Network for Digital Commerce. Uh, a, this is a revamping or a reimagining of the e-commerce ecosystem learning from UPI, with an objective to address dominance of a few companies in the e-commerce space. As you know, much of the internet is a winner takes all market. There's usually number one or number two. And this is an attempt to switch from a marketplace ecosystem to a protocol based ecosystem. So we'll talk in great detail about this. Sarvesh will take that up, and I'll butt in whenever there's something that I want to add. But before we begin, I just wanted to let you know about some of the work that we've been doing over the last month. We focused on quite a bit on the cryptocurrency ecosystem, about why the RBI is constantly pushing back, and there seems to be upcoming restrictions on the way the crypto space is going to operate. Online gaming has been an area of focus for us for a while. We also covered, for example, the fracas between Razorpay and Alt News, and around temporarily disabling Alt News's account regarding FCRA violations. We covered that in the last members call as well. We've covered blocking of websites, of accounts, of apps, of content over the years. And last month we also focused on Twitter going to court against the Indian government. We've also looked at the BNPL, the buy now pay later ecosystem. We've focused quite a bit on the payment space. But there's an interesting story that you might want to check from last month also, which is not in this list, which is about the digitization of land records, and especially in Bihar. We've also looked at the Mohammed Zubair case and what it means for the internet in terms of how people are sort of targeted for content that they put online. And of course Parliament began last month, and we've covered this entire session of Parliament, from questions to debates to the introduction or the what was supposed to be introduced but not introduced. We covered the data protection bill not being introduced. We've covered aspects of the digital media bill, which have also not been introduced. And so Parliament questions is something that we focus on quite a bit. The fun story for me for the month was about Google Street View and its and it being resumed again. And I covered most of when Google Street View was banned in India. So there's a lot to read that we've covered for you. Next, please. Also, just in case you've missed the last few members calls, if you're a subscriber, you can go and access the first part of all of these calls. So the one that I got the best feedback on was the call that we did on Web3 and the metaverse. Do take a look at that. I mean, we also covered the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war. And then for a couple of months, we did more generic conversations where different reporters came and talked about the stories that they worked on, the IT rules, crypto banning, the certain rules, Twitter versus government, the RBI's Vision 2025 document. So if you missed the last few members calls, please remember they are on MediaNama. You can access them using the members call tag. As if you're a subscriber, you can watch the first part of those videos, just like you can watch the first part of this video later on as well. Next, please. So with that, I'll hand over to Sarvesh. Just remember that none of this is legal advice, none of this is business or investment advice. All we're talking about is what we're seeing in terms of our reportage and how we think about how the space is getting shaped. Sarvesh, over to you.
Thanks, Nikhil. Good afternoon, everyone. So these are the themes that we'll be broadly covering today on ONDC. So we'll start with the scope of digital commerce in India and why ONDC is being pushed by the government and other players. What ONDC is, what it's not, what are the various building blocks for ONDC, how the whole network will work, what are the problems that ONDC is trying to address, and how successful might it be in addressing this. What are the similarities between UPI and ONDC, and where do those similarities end? The potential benefits to the various stakeholders, sellers, buyers, platforms. And we'll briefly touch on ONDC and privacy, ONDC and data use. And then we'll cap it off with the current status of ONDC, how many cities are there, how many platforms have been onboarded, and what do we see in the coming few months. To set the tone, I just want to talk about the larger digital commerce, economics of digital commerce in India, and that will give you a good idea of where ONDC, the idea of ONDC is coming from. Currently, if you look at e-commerce, if you look at retail as a whole, Kirana stores are they account for 80% of India's retail market, but they are most of them are not digitally present, and this is the same for MSMEs. Even if you look at the number of internet users in India and the percentage of that who have been using e-commerce, only 20% of internet users in India are online shoppers. It's even though it's only 20%, we are still the third largest online shopper base. So all this signals the potential, the gap that is there to be filled. And if you look at the e-retail penetration in terms of gross merchandising value, which is a metric used to see how e-commerce is doing, how e-commerce companies are doing, the digital retail market in India was $38 billion US dollars in 2020, which was about 4.3 to 5% of India's total retail market. When you compare that to other countries like China, South Korea, and UK, they have e-commerce penetration of 25, 26, 23%. So all this just says that there's a lot of untapped potential in e-commerce, and this is where ONDC comes in, because ONDC has set for itself the goals of by 2027, ONDC wants to onboard 90 crore buyers onto the network. Currently, we have 14 crore online shoppers in India. It wants to onboard 12 lakh sellers. Right now, Amazon has 10 lakh sellers and Flipkart has 4 lakh. And it wants to increase the gross merchandise value from 2.85 lakh crores to 6.5 lakh. So even though the narrative in media is that ONDC is being pitched to challenge the dominance of Flipkart and Amazon, which is also there. But if you see what the chief business officer has to say, Shirish Joshi, chief business officer of ONDC, what he has to say, he said that we're not here to challenge Flipkart and Amazon. We are essentially here to help small retailers leverage digitization and the whole scope that's there in e-commerce. With that, I'll just get into what ONDC is. Here's a timeline of how this whole idea began and where we are right now. In November 2020, we had the Commerce Ministry set up a steering committee to study ONDC's potential. But the actual idea for ONDC goes before that. And in 2018, we had a private company, a Bangalore-based private company called Beacon Foundation, which was co-founded by Nandan Nilekani. And Beacon Foundation first introduced the idea of having open mobility. What they wanted to do was bring about protocols and specifications to enable interoperability in the mobility sector. So ride hailing, buses, taxis. They wanted to create a network where apps can be built that will show options to customers from all kinds of transport, not just from one or two ride hailing services. So that's where the initial idea came about for open network. And then Beacon eventually widened its scope and said that our protocols can also now be used for other e-commerce purposes, not just ride hailing and mobility. And right now, if you fast forward to 2022, Beacon is now powering the ONDC protocols. But I'm now jumping ahead. So the actual momentum was set for ONDC in July 2021 when an ONDC advisory council was set up, and members included Nilekani from Beacon and R.S. Sharma. Then between October and March of this year, October last year and March of this year, that's when we saw a lot of activity happen in terms of the government establishing a non-profit Then different stakeholders started picking up stake in ONDC, banks, the National Stock Exchange, NSDL. They all started picking up different stakes. And then onboarding of platforms also began around then. In April this year, we saw ONDC launch as a pilot in 5 cities, and the first transaction was done when a customer ordered coriander using the Paytm app. And then fast forward now, right, this month, as of this month, we have 9 platforms which have completed onboarding onto ONDC. It's currently available in 20 to 30 cities. And we are expecting a public rollout somewhere this month, and also for ONDC to launch in about 100 cities. That's the target that they have. And by the end of the year, we are looking at a nationwide launch of ONDC. So to understand how ONDC will work, we'll just go back to how e-commerce currently works. If you look at the diagram in the left, so the only way now, if a seller wants to sell something on Amazon, the only way for the seller is to use the proprietary tool provided by Amazon, which is Amazon Seller Central. So they go to Amazon Seller Central, they say we have these products, and they list these products. And the only way for customers to access these products are through Amazon's website or the iOS and Android app. You cannot access Amazon, the goods sold on Amazon from some other platform. The same applies if you take Flipkart. If you want to sell something on Flipkart, you have to use Flipkart's tools, and then the buyers have to use the Flipkart app. The other way is companies, this is the marketplace e-commerce model. And then the other way is the inventory-based model, where companies can have their own platforms. They don't sell on Amazon or Flipkart. They can build their own platform. Like, for example, you can use Shopify to build a platform if you're an artist and you want to sell your art store. But the main idea over here is this model is siloed, as in if you list something on Amazon, it's not going to show up on Flipkart. And if a buyer is searching for something on Flipkart, he's not going to be able to see what's listed on Amazon. And the same goes for if you have your own website. So the only way you get listed on each of these sites is by using the proprietary tools of all these sites. And this siloed model is something that ONDC wants to break. The way it wants to do that is by using these ONDC protocols, which acts as the middle layer that broadcasts whatever the seller has available for the buyers. So again, I'll walk you through an example. So suppose there's a Kirana store that wants to sell its products online. So the Kirana store can go and download a seller side app, which, for example, Go Frugal, and it can list all the products that's available in that store on Go Frugal. Now, when a buyer uses a totally different app, for example, a buyer uses an app called MN Store or Paytm to look for groceries, the buyer gets shown not just results that Paytm's own seller side app will have, but also all the other seller side apps. So anything listed on Meesho, anything listed on Go Frugal, anything listed on the own website of some brand. So all these results will be visible in the buyer's Paytm app, and the buyer can make a purchase. To drive the point home, think about it. There was a purchase journey for a buyer. So suppose you're a customer who's searching for shoes on the MN Store app. Your search request is now broadcast to all the seller-side apps via ONDC protocols, and these seller-side apps respond with results. The results are then aggregated in the MN Store, the fictional MN Store app, for customers to browse and choose. And once you selected who do you want to buy it from, which seller app you want to buy it from, which product, what price, everything you get to select. You also might have the ability to select logistics provider, which payment processor you want to use. The reason I'm saying you might is because sellers also have the option to say, we will only supply through these logistics providers. So it's an optional parameter for when it comes to buyers. The idea, if you look at this, what I've talked about so far, the idea is to unbundle the different parts of an e-commerce value chain from when you buy to when you get the product. Right now, if you buy something on Amazon, the entire chain is controlled by Amazon. Who ships it to you, what payment processor you use, who the seller is, everything.
But you go back a couple of slide surveys. I just wanted to make a couple. One more. So if you look at it, what essentially any marketplace does is that it connects infinite sellers with infinite buyers in a sense. So because it's impossible for each individual buyer to go to each individual seller and therefore move from product to product or store to store, trying to find the right seller at the right price. The role of a platform is essentially seller discovery and price discovery. I mean, auction platforms have also done something similar. But what the internet has got is that you've got multiple platforms that are competing with each other, so that they can each aggregate a large number of buyers, a large number of sellers, so that they can get a large number of buyers, right? So platforms are in the business of infinite fragmentation and monetizing their aggregation. But then platforms don't necessarily talk to each other. If you move to the next slide, please. And what we're looking at over here is to almost commoditize the seller side of the ecosystem so that there is infinite fragmentation on the on the aggregator side, because then everyone will have access to the same buyers or same number of buyers, and effectively between platforms there's not going to be any exclusivity. And on the buyer side, again, they will have access to all sellers and all data from all sellers through those. Although I think they will have the ability to curate. I think Sarvesh will probably talk about that. But it allows access for a buyer via a buyer side app to uh, uh, sellers who have an ease of aggregation, or seller side apps that have an ease of aggregation. So it sort of reduces the workload required to go and onboard sellers, because the platform, or the protocol, which is ONDC, is essentially doing that or enabling that at scale through multiple seller side apps. Sarvesh, back to you.
Yeah. So in a way to summarize what we've said so far, it's ONDC is trying to unbundle the different aspects of e-commerce. So the selling part, the logistic part, the payments part, and make it each into a microservice and make it flexible in terms of how the consumer or the seller chooses to go with which service. Sometimes it's easier to understand what ONDC is by looking at what it's not. So ONDC is not an e-commerce platform. It's not going to be an app. It's not going to list all products. It's not a platform. It's not a super app which combines multiple platforms or multiple apps. It's not a central intermediary, and it's not a medium that's going to help digitize businesses. In a way, if you want to think of it as roads being built, and the various stakeholders as sellers, buyers, logistics providers who use the infrastructure made by ONDC. And ONDC's applications, so far we've used examples of e-commerce to illustrate it, but it doesn't end there. E-commerce is one aspect of how ONDC will be used. It can be used for mobility. So in mobility, to give you an example, imagine there's some other app which not only shows you results from Uber, but also from Ola. You no longer have to shift between apps to see which is offering lower price. And not just Ola and Uber, but it also shows you the local autos, the local taxis, the bus options that you have. So that's exactly the app. It's called the Yatri app, which is now active in Kochi, and Beckon's protocols are powering it. And it also can be used for food delivery, hotel booking, ticketing, any kind of commerce activity, any kind of activity that involves digital sales or digital aggregation. It can be used in that context. Why is ONDC frequently compared to UPI? If you look at this is what the ONDC diagram is, which I showed you before. And if you look at the UPI diagram, you'll understand where the similarities are. In UPI, the senders are sellers in ONDC and the receivers are buyers in ONDC. And UPI has a similar structure in a way that if I'm a sender using a HDFC bank and I want to send money using the Google Pay app, I can do that to some merchant who has an SBI bank and who's using a Paytm app. That is enabled by UPI protocol. So that's really where the similarities are. And another reason that the government keeps making comparisons to UPI is because the success that UPI has had in digital transactions, more than half the digital transactions taking place now are through UPI. So by alluding to that success, the government wants to show the potential of ONDC. But that's pretty much where the similarities end, because there are far more differences. For example, in UPI, there's just one stock keeping unit, which is money. With ONDC, you're dealing with millions of products, different kinds of services, and all these products and services have subjective variables. You have to think about the quality of the product, the reliability of the seller, the speed of delivery, how returns and refunds are processed. And there's also a lot of physical interaction with ONDC, and that's not the case with UPI. It's completely digital. In ONDC, the storage of the products, the transportation, the end use all happen in the physical world. And because of these reasons, there are more opportunities for dispute in ONDC, which is not as big a concern in UPI. And the dispute resolution mechanism for ONDC will need to be far more comprehensive if you think about it. And another aspect is UPI offers it promised to offer improve convenience because you didn't have to enter so many details. You just had to scan a QR code, or you just had to enter the UPI ID to send money. But with ONDC, we're not getting any obvious improved convenience because Amazon and Flipkart already offer like a lot of convenience in terms of e-commerce shopping. So it's not adding much value in the convenience front. So that's why the similarities end with just that both of them are protocols, but the list of differences goes far beyond that.
Yeah, but Sarvesh, there is a dispute issue in UPI, right? The addressing of fraud in UPI isn't there. There is no consumer forum, etc., where you can actually dispute the products that you have, or rather the money that you've transferred if it's not been received. If there is fraud and money is being siphoned from your account, that's also not addressed. So if you look at those problems and you look at ONDC from that perspective, the scope for issues is substantially greater. But I guess consumer protection is going to be one of the main things that will determine the success of ONDC. And if you go back to how e-commerce happened in India, there have always been marketplaces like FabMall was there many years ago. And I remember buying audio cassettes from them, by the way. But there was India Times shopping, there was Reader's shopping. But the one thing that was that I remember people complaining about back in the day in like 2006, 7, 8 was that there's no reliability of whether you're receiving that the product that you ordered. The quality of product was a big problem. Returns were an issue. I remember the first time I heard about Flipkart was when a friend from the advertising industry called me up and said, you got to check these guys out because they're actually delivering what you've ordered and they're delivering it within 2 days. I'm just wondering about whether these issues are actually going to be one of the main things with the ONDC and really determine the success of whatever happens with the ONDC, because reliability, fraud, all of these issues are going to be major.
Yeah, and then we still don't have a framework that ONDC has put out to say how it will address this. And ONDC is not going to take the liability over here. It's going to be with the seller, but how is it going to happen is something that we still don't know.
In the same way, UPI takes no liability.
Yeah.
NPCI has no liability.
Then coming to who owns ONDC, ONDC is established as a Section 8 company. What that means is it is a non-profit company and it will not be allowed to list on stock exchanges. It's the exact same structure that NPCI has. And as of July, there have been like around 20 odd stakeholders who have committed 255 crores, and these stakeholders now own stakes in ONDC. So here's the list. It's mostly banks, and then there's Bombay Stock Exchange, National Stock Exchange, the Quality Council of India. And among these, I think Punjab National Bank and SBI have like a 9% and 7% stake, which is among the highest. But right now, these are the owners, and it's always open for more investment. So this ownership will be diluted as more and more players participate in it. And the problems with this Section 8 NPCI-like model, one is the lack of accountability. Why should something like ONDC be accountable? Because of the amount of government backing. So ONDC itself was established by DPIIT, and the government, the Ministry of Commerce, keeps pushing ONDC. It keeps putting out press releases about ONDC, keeps talking about ONDC, and there's a lot of government involvement. But despite all this involvement, there's lack of accountability that other public institutions have. Just because ONDC is a private company, it's a Section 8 company, it doesn't have to be accountable. You can't file an RTI with ONDC. And it also, the other problem is there's excessive control of a major part of the economy. Over here, we're talking about the entire digital commerce part of the economy, which is in control in a large way with a private entity. And third thing, the whole not-for-profit model makes you question what the incentives of the various stakeholders are. So we talked about how HDFC, ICICI all have stakes, but if there's no profit to be made out of this whole model, what is in it for stakeholders? It makes you wonder that. And also there's a conflict of interest aspect here, because some of these stakeholders that I showed in the previous slides, they also make apps on the selling side and the buying side. So when they're also participants in the own network that they own. So there's scope for potential conflict of interest there.
So it's like, I'm sorry, but one of the big controversies around marketplaces in India is that they can't be sellers on their own platforms. In this case, banks which own the protocol can be app developers on their own protocol.
Yeah, that's exactly how it is, because Kotak, which is Kotak Mahindra Bank, is one of the stakeholders, and Kotak is now making a seller side or a buyer side app. And like that, there are other stakeholders who are also going to make apps. So now these stakeholders ultimately might have control over how the network policies are framed, how ONDC is going to work, and what if they make it in a way that favors their apps. So that question always exists, right? That's the same with Amazon, because they are sellers. If they're sellers on their platforms, they get to prioritize their sellers over other sellers. So that's the problem with the whole lack of accountability over here and the conflict of interest with stakeholders also participating in the platform. In terms of who runs ONDC, so there's a nine-member advisory council, which puts the overall strategy, the broader picture view, who takes forward with the initiatives. And then the day-to-day leadership is taken care by the CEO, T. Koshi, and Chief Business Officer, Shirish Joshi. So this is the list of people in the advisory council. Praveen Kandalwal was a part of the advisory council. He's the Secretary General of the Confederation of All India Traders, which frequently criticizes Amazon and Flipkart for their practices, but he resigned, I think, earlier this year due to conflict of interest. What are the potential benefits of ONDC? Starting with sellers, the obvious one is they have access to more buyers, because now sellers have to list on one app but be available to all buyer apps. So if they list on just the Go Frugal app, they'll be shown on Amazon app, Flipkart app, assuming Amazon, Flipkart are onboarded, and they get to have this online presence across apps with a lot less resources, because now they don't have to have backend infrastructure for each separate app, like how right now a seller needs to be spending time and resources to be on Amazon and Flipkart. So that the whole time and cost savings can be obtained over there. There's also autonomy in terms of the terms, because they don't have to accept a platform's terms and conditions if it's unfair. If they feel it's unfair, they can just choose a different platform and still be digitally visible to all the customers. ONDC is pitching commissions around 3 to 5%, which will be shared by the ONDC network itself and the buyer side apps. Compared to the 20 to 30% that Amazon and Flipkart currently charge, this seems a lot cheaper. We still don't know if these are the actual numbers, because it's not been officially announced. And there's also more options for sellers in terms of who they go with for logistics, who they go with for fulfillment, because they don't have to rely on who Amazon or Flipkart chooses for them. When it comes to buyers, the advantages is the inverse: access to more sellers and therefore more choices. And because of more choices, we can expect better prices from the competition. We can also expect faster deliveries because of the presence of hyper-local retailers. The Kirana stores, which might be in your neighborhood, will now have an online presence, and they can deliver it probably quicker than some other platform. And again, the same logistics and payment option flexibility is there with consumers. In terms of tech platforms, the opportunities for them are at various levels of ONDC. They can create a seller side app, they can create a buyer side app, they can create a logistics app, they can create the gateways which enable the interaction between the seller side and buyer side app. So there's a lot of scope for new tech platforms to emerge to support. And a couple of platforms that I've already onboarded are new platforms. They have been built up to support ONDC. So that's just an example of what's in there for tech platforms. And they also get to access new apps, new platforms get to access the growing digital commerce. We already spoke about the potential of India's digital commerce. So now there's a way for new companies to tap into that using an existing infrastructure. And this infrastructure also reduces the time to market and time to scale, because you already have you don't have to build your own customer base. You don't have to sit and build your own you don't have to experiment with how to market, how to scale, because you already have the ONDC network. You just join the network, which eliminates a lot of your costs in terms of how you expand or how you provide to more buyers. And also it allows platforms to focus on specific niche aspects. So for example, if I'm a buyer app, I will focus on what algorithms to make for the search, how to make discovery better, and how to offer the best products. I wouldn't be focusing on the logistics part, but some other aspect in the ONDC chain will take care. So you're not responsible for both these aspects, and you can focus on whichever you want to. Coming to the building blocks of ONDC, this is a broad overview. The center is the ONDC network. I'll get into the details of each of these, but to give a pictorial idea of what we're looking at, the ONDC network in the center, and then there's the supporting services known as the ONDC network services shown on the right. And on the left, we have exchange of data with other networks like ONDC. Coming to the ONDC network, the network itself consists of buyer-side apps. And when I say buyer-side apps, I'm not just talking about apps because that's limited in potential, but any kind of way in which buyers can buy. This can be like chatbots or voice assistants. All of these will be considered as buyer-side apps, and all of these can plug into the ONDC network. When I talk about seller-side apps, I'm talking about aggregator apps like Flipkart, Amazon, and I'm also talking about if a company has its own backend and they don't cater to other sellers, they just want their own products. So their own backend is also considered a seller-side app in this context. And ONDC has said that they will make reference buyer and seller-side apps so that others can emulate that idea, but we haven't seen these reference apps yet. The third important aspect in the network block is gateways. The gateways is what allows the discoverability of all the sellers on the network, and it allows buyers to cast their search request to all the sellers. And these gateways are in turn powered by backends adapter interfaces. So these are essentially a technical way of saying open APIs, open protocols, which enable the exchange of information. To give you a better idea with something you can relate to, if you look at email, email works based on two main protocols, SMTP and IMAP. And these two protocols is what makes a mail sent from a Gmail account viewable on an Outlook account and vice versa. So you can think of the backend protocol as something like SMTP and IMAP, but for e-commerce, which allows the exchange of information despite the different apps, the different platforms. It provides basically the language that, the common language that different apps and platforms can use.
And I wanted to just question one aspect of this service. You're saying open APIs and protocols. We've heard similar things said about UPI as well. But the thing with email protocols like SMTP and IMAP, etc., are that anyone can rely on those protocols and create an email client. In this case, you would still need ONDC's permission to create an e-commerce client, right? In the same way that you still need approval from NPCI to create a UPI client, correct?
Yeah,
it's not
open in that sense.
So it's not really open as a protocol, it's a controlled protocol.
Yeah, you're correct in that sense. It's not an open protocol that any developer can just go plug into, but it's also not as restricted as UPI, where there's more restrictions on who can make a UPI app. With ONDC, I think it's the conditions for you to become a seller app or a buyer app are much lesser, but it's not open in the sense of the word that in the sense of the developer word that open.
So it's not open because open is it's an extreme situation.
Correct.
Closed is the other extreme. If it's somewhere in the middle, it's neither open nor closed.
Yeah, I think it's better to just call it.
Sorry, I tend to become a little didactic about some of these things because
you're right.
The misuse of the word open.
Yeah. It's better to just call it like APIs and protocols. It's not really open APIs. The second block of the ONDC is the network services. So this consists of registry, which maintains a list of the participants, the seller side and buyer side apps. And it also has the network policies, which is basically the rules and code of conduct about how different apps should behave. So how should they carry out registration of users? How should they carry out transactions, the payment? How should they handle data? And what criteria should they look at before products listed by a seller are shown? So the network policy is basically the rule book for the entire ONDC. And the network services part also consists of data policies. And admittedly, the data policies part, so all this is from the ONDC strategy paper, all this content. But the privacy and the data policy part has not been expanded. So basically, they say that they want transaction data to only reside with the buyer and seller, and ONDC won't have access to it. and also that the data will follow a consent-based approach and have purpose limitation. But apart from just these like these broad lines which say this is what they want, we don't have a privacy policy which has been put out to show how ONDC will achieve this. So all that's still awaited. The network services also will look at how dispute resolution should be carried out. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but little more detail on this. So ONDC wants to adopt the online dispute resolution mechanism that's been proposed by Niti Aayog in one of its reports. So, but again, we don't have a comprehensive outline of what how the dispute resolution will work, who's going to exactly take liability, and etc. There's also going to be ledgers. Reputation ledger here basically refers to the reputation that different sellers have, and maintaining how, like, it's like the Amazon's version of star rating and reviews. So there'll be a ledger to maintain that. And payment processors also will be part of the network services aspect. The third block is interaction with external networks. So ONDC will not only have data within its own network and sharing of data, but it'll also share this data with other networks. For example, there's another thing called OCEN, Open Credit Enablement Network, which is being pitched as a network to enable lenders, loan service providers, and account aggregators to come and interact. And the whole idea behind that is to improve the credit facilities. So like ONDC wants to share data with OECN in a privacy protected manner. Again, we don't know what privacy protected manner here means, but these are the three main building blocks without getting into the technical details of the exact APIs that are being used for all of these. This is the broad idea of the blocks. Coming to the big part of this presentation, what problems does ONDC want to address? Essentially, if you look at it, it comes down to the first point. Apart from just enabling digital commerce as a whole, in terms of problems to address, it's the dominance of Amazon and Flipkart, which currently have over a 60% market share. And because of this dominance, they enjoy network effects. What I mean by network effects, basically, buyers go to Amazon because there are sellers on it. Sellers go to Amazon and Flipkart because all the buyers are on it. So because of this closed loop network effects, they get to unilaterally set policies because they know sellers have nowhere else to go, and they can bundle their services. They say that you have to use our payment processor, then the seller has to use the payment processor offered by Amazon. He cannot go and negotiate for some other payment processor, and they have to pay the commissions that's been asked of them. They have to also tolerate all the other anti-competitive conduct, the alleged anti-competitive conduct, like lack of platform neutrality, which is when Amazon has like certain preferred sellers like Cloudtail and Appareo, and if they prefer these sellers over third-party sellers, that's lack of platform neutrality. Or if they prefer their own products like Amazon Basics products or the Solimo brand, which also Amazon owns. So if they prefer these products in search rankings over third-party products, and this ties into the whole idea of lack of transparency.
I had a question, Sarvesh, about bundling of services. Who gets to pick? So, for example, if I am running a seller-side app that is aggregating, that is asking sellers to upload their catalog to the marketplace, and the sellers going to take care of the deliveries, does the seller pick who does the delivery? Or is it on the buyer side where the buyer, when they're purchasing a product, they can pick who does the deliveries? Same thing with payment gateways. Where do the partnerships happen? On the seller side app, which is aggregating, or on the buyer side app, which is akin to what we see today as marketplaces?
So in ONDC, the seller gets to pick which logistics provider and payment provider, but the seller can give 2-3 options and say that the customer can choose from this. So it's like, I think the first priority of which logistics provider and payment provider is with the seller, and the second priority, if there are options, it's with the customer. So that's how the ONDC
looks. So in that case, the buyer side app itself has no control over anything, and therefore it's like what you have with UPI in terms of a consent manager, right? It's just displaying a product portfolio, and it is essentially it has no control over who the seller is, perhaps, or maybe it has no control over the catalog that is displayed because it's picking sellers. How does this work?
So essentially, I think the buyer app only has control over how to display the products. So it sends a query out and it gets a list of all the products and which seller is selling them through which app, and it lists all that. And if it'll have a unified cart, you can add two products from two different sellers. It will have a unified cart to show that these are your products. But once the order is placed and like the logistics part is taken care by the seller side, the buyer side app doesn't involve itself in that. So I think in a way, it's just to help the customers discover products. That's where the role of the buyer app ends, and they get a 1%, 2% commission fee for helping sellers find their buyers. So that's their model.
Understood.
Yeah. Coming back to the problems that ONDC wants to address, another aspect is misuse of data. So there's allegations that Amazon finds which product is selling like hotcake and makes its own Amazon Basics versions of that product. And there were reports on how it took exact measurements of some of the shirts and pants made by other brands, and then it copied and made a exact version, found the exact supplier of that company and made a Amazon Basics version of that.
Well,
and worst part is this.
That's how they build the marketplace. So I don't know if folks remember, before Amazon launched, about 4 months before Amazon.in launched, and we broke the story. They launched Junglee.com. They bought Junglee.com from Ashish Gupta and a bunch of other guys who later formed a VC fund. I think Nexus Venture Partners was the one. And they launched Junglee.com in India, and then they invited all the e-commerce players at that time, Snapdeal, Let's Buy, and a whole bunch of them. They all, I think 6 or 7 of them participated. The story will be up on MediaNama if you want to go and check it out. 2011 perhaps or sooner. And the one company that did not sign up with them for this was Flipkart. And what Amazon did with Junglee was that, I'm guessing that they use this to understand what products are available, who the sellers are, what the pricing typically is, and they basically aggregated the inventory from multiple e-commerce players. 3 months later, they launched Amazon.com. Amazon.in. Junglee.com was still live, but nobody went to Junglee after that. So Amazon has a history of learning from others, to put it politely.
Yeah, learning from others. The worst part about this misuse of data, the allegation is that not just that Amazon and Flipkart use data to build these kind of products, but they don't share this data with sellers. They make this data like from sellers. They aggregate this from sellers' activities, but they don't share that data with sellers. Then the other issue is deep discounting, predatory pricing in terms of how they use foreign funds to heavily discount products. And in the short run, this is beneficial to consumers, but in the long run, when competition is pushed out, it allows Amazon, Flipkart to charge a higher rate and have customers with no other alternative. So you pay higher prices in the long run, even though in the short run, the predatory pricing might seem beneficial to you. And then there's exclusive agreements with, for example, smartphone manufacturers that, you'll only sell on Amazon, at least for like the first 15 days, only then you can start selling on physical stores or the small other retailers online. There's also the lack of portability of trust. If you're an excellent seller on Amazon with 5-star ratings, 10,000 reviews, and you want to go to Flipkart, there's no way you can have that same trust on Flipkart. You have to start fresh in Flipkart. And there's also cost of being on multiple platforms. You not only have to manage Amazon Seller Central, but also Flipkart Seller Hub. There's no unified tool to let you manage both. And these are the problems that ONDC wants to address. But the question is, will ONDC be able to address this? And this is a question that we posed to competition lawyers. And it's been like, we've got two sides. One side is that, yeah, ONDC is the best way to address these concerns. And the second was the total opposite in terms of ONDC is not a one-size-fits-all solution. You cannot have a structural solution like ONDC to address competition concerns. So I'll talk about both these angles. So first one, in terms of why it might not address competition concerns, starting with, there's no mechanism to prevent anti-competitive conduct. We talked about the network policies, which is essentially the rules or the code of conduct. but the network policies don't have anything uh, to prevent self-preferencing. Now, for example, Amazon onboards onto ONDC. Amazon has a seller-side app and a buyer-side app. There's nothing stopping Amazon from preferring its own seller-side app on the buyer-side app, which is essentially how Amazon works right now. So there's nothing hard-coded in the rules to prevent that. And there's nothing to prevent how ranking is done. So Amazon can continue ranking Amazon Basics products above all other products. So who gets prioritized? So there's no mechanism inbuilt into ONDC. Then there's also this idea about how long local businesses might get squeezed in the long run, because this is from the Parliamentary Committee report on e-commerce regulations. And they, in their report, they examined if ONDC will work. And their broader opinion was that ONDC is still premature. It doesn't seem to address competition concerns, and there's a lot more work needs to be done. This report came out 2 months back, and we've covered it in detail on our site. The idea here is the prominent e-commerce players can still continue to offer heavy discounts or predatory price. If Amazon is going to continue to offer the best prices on ONDC, why would you choose some other seller? And again, now if you're going to continue choosing Amazon, then local businesses eventually get squeezed out, right? There's nothing to regulate prices in ONDC to say. And there's also no roadmap or strategy on how MSMEs are going to be onboarded. So the ONDC is saying that it wants Kirana stores, it wants MSMEs all to be on the platform, but there's no, the strategy paper does not talk about how it's going to get them onto the platform, like what technical assistance it's going to provide, what are the steps it's going to take on its own to help MSMEs or Kirana stores. And also ONDC, Nikhil, you want to talk about
Yeah. So, just to that point that Sarvesh raised about how can they control pricing on ONDC, or how can they control discounting on ONDC? The fact is that they can. What we've seen with UPI, and I'm going to talk mostly about the UPI side of things, is that you've moved from what was an open and competitive market to a monopoly. So two sides. One, when UPI came on and was pitched, from what I understand, as a Paytm killer, wallets were becoming increasingly dominant, and banks were worried because at that point in time, Paytm had more wallets than Citibank had bank accounts. And so wallets replacing bank accounts was a big concern for banks. And that's why UPI was essentially pushed by the banks. But also it served one other purpose that the Indian government had, and they tried to, through NPCI, address it, which was countering MasterCard and Visa. So they tried RuPay hadn't taken off. But what UPI has essentially enabled is the movement from a duopoly, essentially, of MasterCard and Visa to a monopoly, essentially, of UPI. Not a monopoly, you can say that cards and other modes of payments still exist, but it is a dominant form of payments in the digital space today, as opposed to wallets. Wallets have barely grown. I was surprised to see that wallets have actually grown a little bit since UPI launched, but they've barely grown as compared to what UPI has done. And so the other part was because there were multiple wallet players coming up. That comparative situation got addressed. And what you have now is a centralization of power in digital payments with NPCI. And who's to say that you won't move from a duopoly of Amazon and Flipkart to a monopoly of ONDC eventually? Not going to be as easy, perhaps, but that is a potential question. And what you have with a monopoly, that is, even though it's a non-profit private company, just like NPCI is, there is still a significant amount of government control. And so you have centralized control in NPCI. Will there not be centralized control in case of ONDC? Two examples here. One, the imposition of zero MDR. How is it if NPCI is indeed an independent entity, and it's not a regulated entity, it doesn't have a license to operate with the RBI, does it? I don't think so. But how is it that they've been able to impose zero MDR? The Indian government has been able to push zero MDR, which basically destroys business models for payments companies on UPI through NPCI. So if ONDC is a similar, where you're moving from an open competitive market to a controlled so-called protocol-driven market through ONDC, who's who is to decide that the protocol won't be used to determine business models going forward, and there won't be centralized government control, and therefore government control over how the entire e-commerce and commerce market operates through ONDC eventually. Um, Most of these markets move towards a consolidation, and because of the lack of business model and lack of competition in UPI, for example, you're now largely left with 2-3 players. Google Pay and Phone Pay are the largest. Phone Pay, I think, is larger right now, but it fluctuates. Paytm is a distant third, and the rest are not even a whimper, in that scheme of things. So you really don't have much left, and therefore, what the government is now doing is through NPCI imposing, and they haven't figured out how to do this, but a 30% restriction in terms of operations in UPI. Can the same thing play out in ONDC? And so in that situation, where's competition? Where is product innovation, for example? There are perfect substitutes pretty much, these three payment apps, and there is no real innovation in terms of user experience because the interface for UPI remains the same irrespective of which app you are using. And remember, WhatsApp tried to change things around, and following Paytm's complaints, the UX was largely restricted for UPI apps. And so you've got no innovation in terms of user experience. You've got limitation of competition. You've got business models being controlled by the government, and you've got centralized control coming in. And so this is a real risk with ONDC. And the question really that one asks is, what is the advantage for anyone to launch an ONDC app? And there's one piece that sorry, if you could just go on mute. One question that I had asked when Google Pay launched on UPI was about the choices that they had. They could have launched a wallet, they could have become just a payment gateway, and they could have become and they could have done UPI. They chose UPI, which is essentially a platform, an ecosystem, a protocol, or whatever you call it, controlled by a single third-party entity, which was invariably controlled by the Indian government or the Reserve Bank of India. So why would a player launch in this space when you've seen what's happened with UPI? I mean, make no bones about it, I love UPI. I think what it's done for payments and how easy it is to make payments is fantastic. But there is no rationale for any of these apps to be in the UPI business because there is no business model there. So these are pitfalls of NPCI and UPI, and these are the risks that ONDC also runs. Sarvesh?
Yeah, thanks, Nikhil. Coming to the other side of things on why ONDC might be able to address some of the competition issues. So the starting with the biggest impact is that it will break down network effects. I already talked about network effects where buyers go to a platform because sellers are there, sellers go to a platform because all buyers are there. But this is no longer going to be a major thing when your product will be shown to all buyers. And when you're, as a buyer, you can see products from all sellers, despite just being on one app. So that network effects of existing platforms breaks down. So that's one reason how competition concerns might be addressed. The second is there's now ONDC reduces the barriers to entry. How does it do this? Because of the interoperability we have, we do not, and like the reduce cost to digitize. So now it's easier for you to get online without having to spend this amount of time and resources you had to earlier, because you don't have to onboard onto 2 different apps. You don't have to manage your own website alongside that. So all you have to do now is just set up one, go on board one app, and you're discoverable throughout. So your barriers to entry reduce. Then the value proposition that incumbents have also goes away. Right now, the value proposition of Amazon and Flipkart is that sellers and buyers are there. So that might no longer hold, and we might see So right now, so for example, Xiaomi signs an exclusive deal with Amazon because it knows that there are more smartphone buyers on Amazon. But this might not be the case if ONDC picks up and grows to be successful, because then we might see some sector-specific platform which is focused on selling smartphones. Like how for cosmetics we have Nykaa, which is doing better than Amazon. What if there's a platform for smartphones? And Xiaomi will rather sell on that platform than on Amazon, because now it doesn't have the constraint that it needs to be on Amazon to access the buyers of Amazon. It'll also allow platforms to compete on merits rather than some kind of regulation. Right now, we have FDA regulations which prevent foreign funded platforms from operating inventory-based models. And the parliamentary committee report, which I earlier referenced to, so one of the things suggested in that report is, why are you discriminating between foreign and local platforms? Why can't you have the same regulations for both? If a marketplace entity is not allowed for foreign platforms, don't allow it for local platforms. And vice versa. If you're going to allow it for local platforms, allow it for foreign platforms. But with ONDC, all these questions of regulations is put aside and you're just left to compete on merits. And why this might be a good thing, because some of the aspects I talked about earlier, self-preferencing, for example, is not inherently bad. If you walk into a West Side store or a lifestyle store, you're probably going to see West Side's own private labels or Lifestyle's own private labels shown more prominently compared to other brands like Peter England, Arrow, or whatever. So why is it not a problem in physical retail, but a problem for e-commerce is a question. So with ONDC, you're just left to compete on your merits, and there's no regulation saying you can't do this, you can't do that. Coming to ONDC and privacy, so ONDC and privacy is, admittedly, the presentation has little on it because this whole idea has been rudimentary. It's not yet clear how privacy is going to be handled. For example, there's a tweet by Sandeep Srinivasan, which is on the left. Suppose that he goes out to buy HIV medicine. Is this intent to buy going to be broadcast to all sellers? And will the seller know that it's coming from Sandeep Srinivasa? Will they be able to form profiles based on that? We don't know. And on right, we have Srikant's tweet on how, even if you're not registered on a seller app, but because you place an order through, for example, you order something on Paytm, the Paytm forwards that order to the seller app. Automatically, the seller app receives your address, your phone number. It also knows what you're buying. And all this has happened even though you personally haven't even registered on that seller app. Like you haven't provided any consent to the seller app itself. So how are these privacy concerns going to be addressed? So this is an open question, and we'll get into this more in the discussion if someone has any inputs to share on how this might be handled. Coming to the current status of ONDC, these are the apps that are already on board ONDC and are in the pilot phase. They have been providing services, making deliveries, allowing orders. In the buyer space, we have Paytm. And then today, just this morning, Microsoft announced that it will be launching a buyer app soon. And they want to focus on social commerce. When it comes to seller apps, we have these 5 main apps. And so far, there are about 200 sellers who have been onboarded through these apps. In logistics, we have Dunzo and Grab, both Reliance-backed companies, which are providing the last mile delivery services for local deliveries. And then we have Loadshare and Shiprocket, which are taking care of longer distance deliveries. In terms of companies that are on an advanced stage of development, which is what is it's listed on the ONDC website. So the prominent names are Kotak, PhonePe, which is again Flipkart backed. And on the seller apps, we have Snapdeal. And the ONDC also allows you to act as both a seller and buyer app. So the Common Service Center, which is run by the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. So CSC's digital division, which is the Grameen e-store, wants to create a seller and buyer app. And Flipkart's logistics arms, which is eCart, wants to will start providing logistics services. Apart from this, the ONDC website has listed over 150 companies which are which have initiated integration, and these include some big names like ITC, Dabur, Hindustan Unilever. I presume these companies want to sell their inventory directly through. They're not like building seller apps for other sellers, but for their own purposes, so that buyers can discover their products directly from them. And there's also telcos like Vodafone, Airtel, which want to make apps. And it makes sense for these because Airtel, Jio, Vodafone, if you see that if you're an Airtel customer, you probably have the Airtel app on your smartphone. Now, all that this app needs to do is connect to ONDC and it becomes a shopping app. So it makes sense for telco companies or banking apps which already have an existing base to leverage ONDC, and that's what they're doing here. ONDC is also working with other organizations like the National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development to onboard agriculture players. It's working with the National Restaurant Association of India to bring on restaurants to compete with Swiggy and Zomato, so that they can directly have these dishes offered on ONDC rather than going through some other platform like Zomato or Swiggy. It's also working with the Small Industries and Development Bank. They signed an MOU yesterday or day before, if I'm correct. And the MOU basically is that SIDBI will, whoever it's offering loans to, it will like help them also onboard onto the ONDC network. Then the Confederation of All India Traders is pushing its members. Importantly, VC firms which kind of fund a lot of these startups, Access, Sequoia, SoftBank, all of them are also pushing their portfolio companies to join ONDC. And Google and Shopify, there's been reports of Google and Shopify exhibiting interest. I put them in the bottom because it's not yet officially listed on the ONDC site. In terms of cities, these are the major cities, about 21 cities where it's already going, pilot phase is going underway. And as I said before, ONDC is looking at 100 cities by the end of August and nationwide by the end of the year. The big question that we have now is, will Amazon and Flipkart join ONDC? There's nothing officially announced, but there was an ET report which says Amazon has exhibited interest, and that the Amazon India spokesperson was quoted to say, we are closely engaging with ONDC to understand the model and evaluate what role Amazon can play. But this is still like not official. The question that
I have a bigger question, Sarvesh. I think they're less worried about Amazon and Flipkart joining ONDC. They're more interested in PhonePe and Google Pay joining ONDC, because they already have a live product with millions of users.
PhonePe is joined. PhonePe will be PhonePe is in the advanced stage of development part of the integration. So they're pretty much, I think, when the public rollout happens, they should probably be on board. And Google has said that it's,
and let's remember, PhonePe was the first UPI app to launch.
Yeah, and it's like, I think they don't want to miss the bandwagon on like this too, and that's why we have a lot of these existing players which were first to go on UPI also show interest on ONDC. But coming back to why Amazon and Flipkart's role might be important in ONDC is, there's a question of, will ONDC even succeed if Amazon and Flipkart don't join? Because Amazon and Flipkart currently have the largest seller base. They have the largest catalog of products in e-commerce. They have a large customer base. They have everything that ONDC will need to just directly jump into the e-commerce space. So if Amazon and Flipkart declines or doesn't decide, what happens to ONDC? Will you as a customer continue to go to Amazon and Flipkart because you're familiar with that, or will you try to experiment with some other Paytm app which is on ONDC? And there's also a question. So if they decide to join, what incentives do they have? Like, one thing that I can think of is they have access. Amazon and Flipkart might be interested because they already have the existing base, and now they have access to also the ONDC base, which means they have access to more buyers and sellers. So it makes sense in that way that they should join the network. But then this brings us to the question: will that increase their dominance? Because they already have economies of scale, user base, convenience. They offer convenience. There's trust. With the ONDC access as well, doesn't it just cement Amazon and Flipkart's dominance? I'm not going to change my buying habits and use some other app, but now I know that Amazon app also shows everything from other sellers, so I'll stick to Amazon. Amazon is going to cement its position in the e-commerce space, right? If they continue to if they get into the ONDC network and leverage the ONDC user base.
That really depends, right? So the question to ask is, has Paytm benefited from joining UPI? Has the Paytm wallet benefited from Paytm joining UPI? Number one, where Paytm was number one, now PhonePe and Google Pay are number one. And
yeah, this whole Paytm thing was baffling. I was reading a Twitter thread the other day of why someone was like, Paytm offers the best user experience in terms of UPI, and they laid out why and everything. And then there was someone else asking, why is it not the most popular UPI app? And there's no answer. Why is it not? It's
so I'm saying
the same thing can happen with Amazon and Flipkart, right? Yeah.
Where's the benefit for them to give their seller database and inventory to a large number of people?
Yeah,
because that inventory will be available to all seller apps, not just
correct.
theirs.
Yeah, those are possible like deterrents on why they might not want to onboard. So that remains an open question now. We don't know if we still, until today, we don't know if Amazon and Flipkart are joining, but we know that Flipkart's other arms like eCart and PhonePe, which is backed by Flipkart, that's joining. And so there's some activity from Flipkart. Maybe they're testing the waters with PhonePe and then they might join as Flipkart itself. So it's an open question. Yeah, I think with that we can conclude the presentation part. This has been a coverage of ONDC the last couple of months, actually over the last year. And I think we can move on to the discussion and we can take questions, comments.
Great. Can we stop the recording, please?